And welcome to my video on newspapers. So newspapers is a close study product for GCSE and for A-level media studies. So if you're a media studies student, you might be asked about any of the four areas: media language, audience, media representation or industries. So there's a lot to cover. So in this video, I'm going to be going through the topics of tabloid and broadsheet newspapers, the difference between them, left-wing and right-wing newspapers, and news values, with some references to the close study products as well. So first of all, tabloid and broadsheet. Historically, this refers to the size of the newspapers. So broadsheet was a much larger newspaper, and tabloid was a much smaller newspaper, so a bit like a tablet, basically. You can remember it because you've got similar words there. Broadsheet newspapers, as I said, they were a larger size and they tended to explore news stories in more detail and covered more political and economic stories, more of a focus on that, whereas tabloids covered more stories that had a personal interest aspect to them or celebrity-based stories and had more of a sensationalist style. Tabloids were, as I've said, smaller, but now some newspapers have changed their size, which is a bit confusing, but the two styles of journalism still remain. So you've got tabloid journalism and broadsheet journalism. So the Times that you might be studying if you're doing AQA or EduCAS media studies, the Times is a broadsheet newspaper and the Daily Mirror is a tabloid newspaper. So the Times, broadsheet journalism, the Daily Mirror, tabloid journalism. So as you can see in the front cover for the AQA GCSE 2021 exam, the Daily Mirror uses typical tabloid conventions. It uses two celebrity-based stories. One is entertainment-based and one is relationship-based. So you've got abbreviations as well, which is more typical to see in tabloid journalism. For example, instead of referring to him as William, you've got Wills. So you're more likely to find colloquial or informal language in a tabloid newspaper, whereas broadsheet newspaper adopts a more formal style usually. Whereas on the Times, typical example of that, you can see that there are two news stories that are more serious in keeping with broadsheet conventions. So this is also from AQA 2021, the GCSE text. So one of the stories is political, and it says it calls for criminal inquiry as top ministers deny security leak. And then one is about the economy. So it says fee-paying schools save the taxpayer 20 billion. So it's worth noting here that readers of the Times would be more likely to send their children to private school because they're likely to be in the ABC1 demographic, more likely to have more power and more disposable income, whereas the Daily Mirror is aimed at C2 to E. So you've got the two demographics there that are being targeted. And whatever exam board you're studying, you'll need to be able to recognise tabloid and broadsheet conventions, both for A-level and GCSE. So the next thing I'm going to focus on is left-wing and right-wing. And this is really important because unlike television and news on the radio, newspapers don't have to be unbiased. So this means that often newspapers will be highly critical of party leaders and will attack the party that they don't support, basically. So they'll publish articles in support of the political party that they favour, and they'll heavily criticise the party or parties that they don't support. So just a bit of a recap in terms of right-wing and left-wing news values. Right-wing values tradition and individualism and free trade, and it's more like survival of the fittest, basically. So it's more sort of up to the individual to make their choices and to be responsible for themselves. Less public tax and less public spending. Whereas left-wing values collectivism, so being part of a group, and so there's more support and provision usually for the community, so for example social welfare and benefits. So it's the idea of all for one and one for all, so the idea that people are together in a group rather than sort of individuals. They tax more but then they spend more as well. So in the UK, the two main parties that newspapers tend to be in support of are the Conservatives on the right and Labour on the left. So right-wing newspapers are newspapers like The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express. The Times is sort of centre-right. And then on the left, you've got The Guardian and the Daily Mirror, which you're looking at for one of your close study products. And there are other newspapers that decide they are going to pitch themselves in the centre of it as well. So they're sort of not leaning that much towards the left or towards the right, they're quite central. As you can see in the two newspapers that you're looking at, we've got Jeremy Corbyn, who was leader in the close study products that you're looking at the moment, the ones that you're going to be asked about in the 2021 exam. And at the time, the leader for the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister was Theresa May. So now that's changed. So we've got Boris Johnson, who's the Prime Minister, and Keir Starmer, who's leader of the Labour Party. But in the newspapers that you're being asked about, you need to know who the leaders were at the time. So left-wing newspapers, they are in support of Labour, so they're critical of the Conservatives. So the Daily Mirror and the Guardian are examples of that. And the Times is, as I said, centre-right, but still quite critical of Jeremy Corbyn. More critical of Jeremy Corbyn than of Theresa May because they're right-wing leaning. So the final thing I'm going to talk about in this video is news values, and that comes under industry. So the media producers, in this case the newspaper companies, decide which events and issues they're going to report on and the order of the importance as well. So which story is going to be their lead story on their front page and then the subsequent order from that. So it's called the news values or it can be called the newsworthiness of a story. So it varies according to the readership. So like we said, the Daily Mirror tends to be C2 to E, whereas the Times is ABC1, and also varies according to whether it's a tabloid or a broadsheet, because they have different styles of journalism, and the political leaning of the newspaper as well. So they'll select certain stories or report in a certain way on certain stories, depending on their political position. Although there are differences, they all have the same news values. So the things that they tend to consider when they're deciding how important a story is are shock and surprise, timing, important people, closeness to home, and then this is more tabloid but it's still worth knowing, human interest as well. So shock or surprise, basically if there's any deaths or there's violence or there's injury, so it could be an attack or it could be a natural disaster. But if there are lots of people that have died or been injured, then that's going to have a high priority in terms of being reported. And then the second one is timing. So how recent the story is. So the more recent the story, the more important it is that it's included because it's breaking news basically. And also certain stories that are running stories are favoured as well. So for example, the World Cup, because that's an event that goes over a certain period of time and readers like to see what's happening in it so they can keep coming back to it. Then also important people, rich and famous people, that includes royalty and celebrities. If one of those people has had a baby, for example, and got married, that's going to be focused on, whereas if it was just an ordinary person, there's no way it would be on the news. And closeness to home is another one, so it's considered more newsworthy if it's in the UK or a country that is near the UK or considered important. So for example, the USA isn't near to the UK, but they're considered to be a powerful country, and we've got a connection with the USA as well. So that would be focused on in our newspapers, in our national newspapers. Finally, human interest. So if it's got an emotional impact, or it's got an entertainment-based side to it, then sometimes that's included as well, particularly in tabloids. So you can remember that as skiff. You've got S for shock or surprise, C for closeness to home, I for important people, and then T for timing, and H for human interest, or a skit that lives in a home. You can decide what a skit is. The last thing I'm just going to mention is that most newspapers are owned by conglomerates. So conglomerate is a really useful word to know in media studies. It is when companies are owned by one parent company. So it tends to be a lot of different companies, and sometimes different companies from different media areas. So for example, Reach PLC owns the Daily Mirror, but they own loads of other companies as well. And News UK owns the Times, but also owns lots of other newspapers too. So it'd be a really good idea now to look up either Reach PLC or News UK or both, and see the other companies that they own, because it gives you a bit of an idea about their size and their power. Okay, so I hope that's given you a good introduction to newspapers, and take care. Bye.